Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Esri International Users Conference and our discussion today on advancing inclusive conservation. I'm David Gadsden, Director of Conservation Solutions at Esri. Today, I'm joined by an extraordinary group of panelists to explore the topic of advancing inclusive conservation. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to briefly set the stage for the topic of today's discussion. Our world is facing incredible challenges, largely due to the modifications of most of the Earth's surface to support a human population now approaching 8 billion. We're losing species at an unprecedented rate in modern history, and we expect these losses to accelerate under the increasing pressure of climate change. Many are working towards efforts to increase conservation efforts, both to stop the extinction crisis, but also to provide space for critical ecosystem services, including the air, water, and food systems that sustain our human population. For those efforts to be sustained, we must acknowledge the critical role of indigenous communities in preserving biodiversity and the importance of not placing additional burdens on marginalized communities, often found adjacent to natural areas. In short, we need to find solutions that benefit everyone and help build towards a global consciousness that nature is critically important to all of our well-being. I'm sure you would agree that we have a long way to go in this journey. And an important first step is hearing from the leaders in the field of advancing inclusive conservation. I'm joined today by three such leaders: Dr. Rae Wynn-Grant, wildlife ecologist and National Geographic Research Fellow; Dr. Laly Lichtenfeld, co-founder and chief executive officer of African People and Wildlife; and Alison Fox, chief executive officer of the American Prairie Reserve. Thank you all for being with me today. To begin, I'd like to first ask how each of you became involved in the field of conservation and how that relates to your organization's work now. Let's begin with Dr. Rae Wynn-Grant.
Hi, thank you so much, David. It is amazing to be here and to be a panelist on such an important and timely topic. So I feel that I personally have a fairly non-traditional path that I took to get into the field of wildlife conservation. I was inspired at a very young age by television. So I grew up in an urban environment. I always lived in cities and yet loved to watch TV, and I loved to watch nature shows. And so although I didn't necessarily understand that I was being introduced to science when I turned on the TV, I was introduced to nature and the natural world, and especially wild animals. So for a long time, when I was growing up, I was always explaining that I wanted to be a nature show host because I thought that was how one could work with animals, and that's how one could be an advocate to save animals. And I'm very fortunate that I ended up on quite an academic path in my life, because through academia, I was introduced to the field of wildlife conservation. And I had some really amazing mentors along the way once I kind of got hooked in college. And I'm really happy to say that the two women that I'm sharing the panel with today have also helped to pave my way into the career. Dr. Laly Lichtenfeld gave me one of my very first full-on true research experiences out in Tanzania in the earlier days of her organization. And so she not only taught me what it's like to do research and how to really be an independent researcher, but also what it's like to build a company, to build a nonprofit that is geared towards saving the environment and enhancing the livelihoods of people. And then Alison Fox from American Prairie Reserve was a part of a group of people who gave me a really unique research experience more recently to study in a part of the world that I never thought I would ever touch down on. And so there has been this amazing academic community that's guided me through my career, as well as really incredible, powerful women who have allowed me to have some really special opportunities that have informed my education. So I got into this field in a very organic way as a young person, and I still carry so much of that energy with me today, especially in terms of my interest in media and my view that media can be a very powerful tool to advance wildlife conservation. But I wouldn't be here without the help of so many other folks.
Laly, how did you get started?
Well, similar to Rae, I just had a passion from a very young age. out the back door and into the woods with my Labrador. But similar to Rae, I was also exposed to TV and magazines, and somehow African wildlife, like the beautiful zebra behind me, just fascinated me. And so everything about my growing up and high school experience and getting to college was about getting to Africa. And I was very fortunate to be able to do that with the National Outdoor Leadership School originally when I was in college, and then to receive a Fulbright scholarship to conduct independent research in Kenya. And, you know, as soon as I got over to East Africa and I heard the lion roar and I met the people and I began to understand that conservation really was about more than just protecting wildlife. It was about looking at the communities around the many protected areas of East Africa and around the world, and ensuring that they have a role and a voice in conservation. And I'm also very excited to see this panel today because it's, again, as Rae mentioned, 3 powerful women, and that's certainly part of the conversation around inclusivity these days. And it's really exciting to share this panel with such wonderful and experienced and capable women. So, you know, after I got to Kenya, I came back and I just continued my research. I did both my master's and my PhD at the Yale Environment School. And after that, it was all about getting out on the ground and really developing a model of inclusive conservation. And I know we're going to talk more about that today. And it's been wonderful to be able to work with folks like Rae. We've also been able to interact with American Prairie Reserve. You know, a lot of these conservation issues we share around the globe. And a lot of the solutions to them are really just about how you engage with people and incorporate them into the conservation process. And I think everybody on this panel does that really, really well.
Alison, please go ahead.
Sure. I will build on the theme here and start with anyone can be a conservationist. American Prairie exists here in Montana. There's a map behind me to do one thing, and that is to build a vast park on our nation's grasslands, a place for both people and wildlife, where all those wildlife species that once called the plains home are home again, and we've honored that natural and cultural heritage. So I came to conservation because of my love of these big landscapes in the West and my interest in history. I am not personally a scientist. I have degrees in history and biology. I did grow up in a rural area. I spent a lot of my childhood outside. My whole life path has been sort of built around being places where I can spend time in nature. I ended up in Montana because I met my husband working in Glacier National Park. I chose Montana for my career because of my love and my happiness being outdoors. But I came to it from maybe a non-traditional background in terms of my academic experiences. And I think that that's not uncommon when I look across our staff and really across the conservation community, where people came from both sort of educationally and work backgrounds. And I guess I'm a believer in the fact that it's not, we need scientists for sure in this community, in this movement, but we also need communicators and attorneys and mediators and historians and people with just a lot of different backgrounds, sociology and psychology backgrounds to come into this field. And so I think an important note on inclusivity is that I feel strongly about building a community that is inclusive of individuals from lots of different backgrounds, but also a community that welcomes people from all of those backgrounds.
Each of you work in some manner on the interface between wild areas, featuring potentially dangerous wildlife, and communities living adjacent to them. What's the role of communities in conservation, and how do you find common ground between preserving biodiversity and supporting sustainable livelihoods? Do maps and GIS play a role in this engagement process? Let's continue with Alison.
Well, as we'll hit on quite a bit today, communities are essential for conservation success, for sure. And I think what we've learned is that the vitality of a community and conservation success do not have to be in opposition, and it's not a zero-sum game. We at American Prairie Reserve actively engage the communities in which we live and work in central Montana. We add to the economic landscape of those communities by providing jobs, by buying all our supplies locally, by being members of the community. And so that our conservation project in and of itself is contributing to the economic success and vitality of the region. But we also engage with the industry that's at the heart, both the sort of economic and cultural heart of our state, which is agriculture. And so there are a number of ways in which we work with local communities. And maybe I'll tell two stories. One, we have a program called Wild Sky, where we work with local landowners who agree to collaborate to make their ranching practices more wildlife friendly. And we provide technical and financial assistance to do that. A key part of that is our Cameras for Conservation program, where we put up camera traps on these local ranches and then pay incentive payments when we see a black bear or a mountain lion on these camera traps. And then we use technology, of course, some of Esri's products to share and collect that camera data. And that's really, we're finding common ground around being both very happy to see the occurrence of wildlife and to see that some of these wildlife species are not adversely affecting the landowner or rancher's operations. Another example I'll cite really involves Rae. About 2 years ago, we had a panel that National Geographic hosted called Living with Wildlife. And we brought conservationists and agriculturalists and wildlife advocates together, about 200 people from all across the state, to talk about strategies for coexisting, living with wildlife. And there was one panel that was also all females, I believe. And there was a rancher from the Rocky Mountain Front, and she was talking about her fear of grizzly bears, and not only for her livestock operations, but as a parent. And Rae did such a beautiful job of relating to, as a fellow parent, to the challenges and to the fear that this woman had, and validating that and listening to that, and then pivoting to some of the conservation successes she'd seen in other areas where grizzly bears had come back to the region. So a lot of this is about just showing up, being transparent, being willing to communicate, and creating the forums for that kind of communication.
Rae, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. This is such an important question, overall the role of communities in the success of conservation. And, for me, there's kind of two ways that I want to answer this question. And one is with a really sincere focus on the environmental and social histories of the communities where conservation work is being done. I feel that it is extremely important that anyone who's designing a conservation initiative or project have a full understanding and acknowledgement of how communities, especially the original communities in these areas, may have been stewards of the environment in their own right. They may have had conservation principles. And in a lot of places, they likely had conservation principles that were at the core of their cultural heritage and how they used the land. In so many landscapes where conservation is done, especially so many where I've worked, we're finding that we as conservationists are doing conservation work that is so similar to the original values that the Native or Indigenous community members had. And when that goes unacknowledged, it can be extremely offensive. And when it becomes acknowledged and really perpetuated, automatically we're taking the first step towards building an inclusive process. And that's something that I've seen done wrong so many times. And when I see it done right, it just alleviates, one of many challenges that the project might face getting off the ground. Additionally, I think both Alison and Laly are going to mention that conservation is rarely successful without the support of the community. So they play a huge role in in creating success, in making a sustainable project or plan happen. And again, because of that, I think that there is often not quite this separation between what is community and what is, a conservation project or plan. I feel that very often the conservation community is the entire community, so when we live in the places that we work, when we are hiring people to work on the projects at the local scale, there's this blurred line between where conservation is done and where the community is, because really we are often all one, all working together. At least that's how I believe that it should be. And with that, we as leaders have this responsibility to make sure that we are not making any community members or their roles invisible to the conservation process. It's super important that we're acknowledging all of the help that is maybe adjacent to science or at the support level, even love, even conversation, even moral support that comes from a community plays a big role in the conservation process. And because of that, when we describe conservationists or conservation projects as including these people only who are maybe extremely active in the project, it erases the roles of so many community members. So, really taking this holistic approach to where conservation is done and where communities are is super helpful. And I'm waving my hands in the air because I'm also visualizing what I'm saying. And that's how GIS tools can really help us have these conversations and assert these values, because we can make maps of where conservation is done and maps of where different communities are or maybe have been in the past and have been moving around due to conservation. And we can really talk about how there's overlaps in people and economies and histories and livelihoods and values. And it's really amazing to have, GIS tools at the levels that they're at today, because I'm able to visualize for my own self, and for the communication of a lot of these ideas and ideals, we're able to help the community also visualize what we mean.
Laly, how does this relate to your work with communities?
I'm completely, it's everything. The holistic approach, I believe, is absolutely critical, what Rae is talking about, and also what Alison is talking about in terms of a landscape level approach to conservation. Conservation is not done in small areas, particularly in East Africa and in Tanzania, where we have huge migratory populations of wildlife moving out of those formal protected areas, what we call national parks or reserves, and moving across wide swaths of communal land. Conservation doesn't stop at those borders, and conservation partners don't stop either. I think for far too long in this part of the world, we haven't really thought of community members as partners in conservation, as individuals who have a point of view about conservation. And we haven't realized that shared dialogue is absolutely critical to conservation success, and that in these communities, there are conservation conversations going on. It may not be the same as the conversations that are happening perhaps in a NGO office, but they're having them and they're shaping their understanding of the landscapes around them and what they want to see for their future. And the more that we embrace those values, incorporate them into the conservation conversation, and include them in the process, the greater success we're going to have overall. And I feel so fortunate in East Africa. We touched a little bit on human-wildlife conflict, about the tolerance. People are incredibly tolerant still of large animals moving around in their essentially backyards. Lions, elephants, African buffalo, dangerous animals. And they're still very tolerant of having them there. And I think historically, we've sort of haven't included their point of view. We haven't included them in terms of having them develop their own understanding of the problems they're facing and develop solutions to them. So at African People and Wildlife, that's something we really emphasize is citizen science, working with community members to understand the conflict. We have many community members across northern Tanzania collecting data on when, for instance, lions attack livestock. They're collecting that data. They're actually using the Esri system to input that into maps. And we are now making that information accessible in real time back to the community members so that they have the power of decision making, those tools right in their hands. And this is what's helped to direct conservation interventions that we've developed in partnership with communities. One of them we're very well known for is the Living Walls Project, which are environmentally friendly, predator-proof corrals that keep livestock safe from lions and lions out of trouble. And this innovation was co-developed and co-implemented with a community of Maasai people who wanted to prevent the conflict and who also wanted to ensure that the roar of the lion would remain across this landscape. It was important to them. It's their cultural heritage. And so the more that we explore and uncover the linkages that people have to their landscapes, to their environment, to their wildlife, the way that they perceive it, the way they feel about it, the more successful we're going to be in conservation, the more inclusive we're going to be in conservation, and the more sustainable in the long term our programming is going to be.
It's clear that you all work with a diverse set of stakeholders who often have competing interests. How do you build trust and ensure that inclusive engagement? What does it take to get everyone invested and at the table? And what processes do you recommend for working towards consensus? Laly, would you like to continue?
Thank you. Absolutely. It is absolutely critical that we start with that shared dialogue, that we really look in the landscapes where we are. And as Rae was talking about earlier, that we ensure that everyone is given a voice. And that's, how do you define a community? It's very difficult to do. There are many groups within communities. There are different geographic boundaries that you might consider in communities. In some degree, GIS can help us as we're looking at an overall landscape in determining, who is residing within that landscape. But then we have to open up the process so that everybody has a voice. And we do that by really getting to know the people that we're working with and ensuring, again, that our team members are coming from these communities, their voices for these communities. And then within that, ensuring that there's a wide representation, particularly in Africa. I think for a long time in many rural places, women, for instance, were not engaged as much in conservation as they should be. It just seemed like it was a male dominated sector. And that, for instance, with us, with livestock and lions, often it was considered that the man, was really in charge of the livestock. But when you actually uncovered it, the women are very, very much responsible for the care of the livestock at the homestead and at night. And when those livestock are not protected, they're the ones to blame. They're the ones that are facing their families in the morning when, that prized cow has been taken by a carnivore. And so we need to ensure that these conversations are including all aspects of society. It is very challenging. In East Africa, we're still challenged by how to help get more of the community voice to the table. Again, we're doing that by helping them to collect more of their data, looking at how their traditional systems of managing the landscapes, what questions do they ask about protecting grasslands, helping them to quantify that information in a way that makes sense, and then provide that information up to government authorities, to other partners by sharing it through hubs, essentially. So I think, again, we're also kind of kicking down that idea that, rural communities in some of the most remote places in the world can't use technology. Of course they can. Of course they can. And it can be a huge, important tool to advance the conservation conversation across these landscapes. So it's a very exciting time, I think, in the history of inclusive conservation, that we're able to now harness technology. We're able to get these voices, their information, their ideas, their points of view to the decision makers that are really governing conservation in these countries.
Alison, how do you work towards consensus across competing interests in Montana?
Yeah, I'll pick up on some of the themes we've heard today. As a land trust, we are a large landowner in central Montana. Our project and what we would like to do at American Prairie Reserve, our vision for our private lands is different than our neighbors, but there are a lot of common values and common ground, and that we work really hard to find those. I think some of those common values are respect for one another's private property rights, a true and deep love of the land and the wildlife species that call that place home, and a strong belief that we need to be good neighbors. And so, a lot of the efforts that we engage in with our neighbors are around those kind of core beliefs and core principles. One example I'll share is that we manage a conservation herd of about 800 bison. And those bison have ear tags, solar powered ear tags that are connected to a long range network. And that long range network allows us to monitor movement and pasture utilization, and can tell us a lot about how bison are acting on the landscape as the ecosystem engineers that they are. But that is a technology that is interesting to our neighbors as well, and for their own management. So we are in the process of putting those similar ear tags on a neighbor's cattle and on bison on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation on their conservation herd. So we are sharing that tool, and then coming together, creating kind of a platform and a shared experience to further transparency and communication, and to drive those discussions around that, as I said, that shared experience, but also those shared values.
Rae, would you like to continue?
Yes, I would. And I'll be really earnest with my response and express that, the overall question, how does one get, varying stakeholders engaged and invested and on board for a lot of conservation projects? It's not something I've figured out yet. I actually don't completely know. And, it's different for me as opposed to the two women who I'm sharing the panel with, who are CEOs of nonprofit organizations. And so they're required to think really broad, really comprehensively about a lot of this. I'm an active researcher and a full-time scientist. And because of that, so much of my work is rooted in scientific explanation, uncovering truth and fact. And so a lot of what I do is putting my head down, doing research, gathering data, analyzing it, understanding patterns, and coming up with facts, and then presenting them. And that does not always offer a solution to getting all stakeholders on board, unfortunately. But that is what I can invest 100% of myself in doing. It's what I believe in, it's what I'm best at, and it's what I'm able to offer for so many of my projects and so many of the places where I work. And so frequently, my presentation of facts and scientific truth helps stakeholders, community members, individuals affected by the project really see it for what it is and get excited and involved. And sometimes it doesn't change minds as much as I would like it to. And so that's where I'm having to learn from so many of my colleagues, so many people adjacent to my science world, in how to build relationships, build trust, change minds, touch hearts in these very socially focused, sometimes even, psychologically focused ways in order to make projects successful. And so it's, I feel very often that I'm on this, lifelong journey being, of personal education in learning how to use science and to use other tools to make sure that everyone is impacted and everyone is informed and is empowered to make decisions for themselves about their feelings on projects or programs.
There's an emerging focus to address inequality in access to nature and improving equitable access to natural areas. What does equitable access mean to you, and how does GIS contribute to that effort? Rae, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I would. I love this question so much, and it's a big, big challenge, not just for the three of us on this panel, but for anyone working in conservation around the world. Because, right now, so many of us are, a part of, or I should say, doing conservation against the forces of capitalism. And so when we have capitalism as this big, system that we're trying to do successful conservation within, equity is not centered just by nature of capitalism and by nature of this globalization that we have come into. Equity sometimes gets misconstrued as equality, and it's such a different word. And so equity is synonymous with fairness and with justice. It is rooted in ideas of justice and social justice. Equity is a process, and it aspires to create and uplift, equity in ideas and power and resources and strategies, in outcomes and solutions. And so I find that, I find that a lot of conservation projects, even ones that I'm actively involved in today, even many of my own, have equity as an aspiration, but not as something that is actively being done. And so equitable access to me means, I as a Black woman, I am so often thinking about equity and conservation in the context of race and the history of race, the social and environmental history, and how race has played a role in, any place where conservation work is being done. So to me, equitable access is a lot about power, and it's a lot about doing justice work, understanding the historical transitions that have happened, how different people from different groups have been impacted, and then undoing that by giving power back to where it originally belonged, to switching out who is, in leadership, to really breaking down a system and rebuilding it back up. And again, I feel very hopeful that the future of conservation is rooted in equity and is able to actively, demonstrate equitable practices. But today I feel that many of these programs, places, organizations, projects are still aspiring to bring equity to the forefront. And again, similar to what I mentioned earlier, as a scientist, I have been so glad to have tools like the different GIS tools that are available to me that help me visualize landscapes across time, across, systems, across processes. I am able to give myself so much of an education just by using GIS to understand inequities and inequalities over time in the space or in similar spaces across the world, and really see how, from a geographic perspective, we can possibly move towards a space of truly putting equity into action. So again, I don't have necessarily too many examples of equitable leadership ideas, access to nature, but I think that we can get there. And I think that visualizing landscapes and visualizing, changes over time using GIS tools and other tools and conversations and, education and everything we have available to us can help us get there.
Alison, how are you approaching equitable access on the American Prairie Reserve?
Yeah, before I touch on that, I just want to thank and acknowledge Rae for her statement about how inclusivity is a work in progress. And, I think engaging communities is a work in progress. I by no means want anyone to think that we've got it figured out. We've made mistake, we've stubbed our toe, we continue to do that from time to time. And I think what I hold on to is that large-scale conservation is about sort of generations of work. And we work with the Ani and Nakota community, some indigenous peoples that border us, and they think about life in generations and decades, and looking backwards and forwards. And that when we're planning for the way we engage communities, I want to make sure as a leader that we're doing that, not just thinking about our 1-year goals and our 5-year goals and our short-term strategic plan, but what that means over the long term. In terms of access, for us, that means in part ensuring that American Prairie Reserve is open to everyone. It's free and open to everyone, and that we have created the tools using GIS to help people figure out how to get to the place, how to be safe when they visit, what they do on the landscape, and there's so much potential there with the tools that are available now. It also means finding a way to teach people about Grasslands American Prairie's vision if they can't get to the place. And so this fall, we're opening what we're calling a National Discovery Center in Lewistown, Montana. This has exhibit space. It has a children's learning zone. It has a conference, an event pavilion, has a theater. It's a way for people to come and learn about the landscape, its people, its history, its wildlife, its your potential future if they can't get out to the landscape. And then our ultimate vision is that the content that is produced in that center is piped out to the world through the internet. And so kind of circling back to what Rae said about learning about nature through television, I think part of accessibility is finding various ways and various communications tools to share your message.
Laly, thoughts on equitable access?
Absolutely. I'm going to go a little bit big picture and then come right down to the fine-grained scale of how we're working on this issue. And certainly in Tanzania, when communities approach the idea of conservation, they're starting from what they feel is a very inequitable system, right? People are not allowed to go into the protected areas with their livestock or to harvest grass or to harvest wood or anything like that, but the wildlife moves out freely from those protected areas into communal rangelands. So immediately it sets up what is to them a very inequitable system. And in Tanzania, of course, it's a very strong government-controlled system. And we are working very hard now with national authorities who are embracing now more of a community inclusive, a community engagement approach. And so I'm very hopeful, and I see positive steps taken now to recognize that conservation cannot happen without these communities being partners. And we're seeing government authorities open up the doorway to conversations now and to recognizing that communities can be partners with them in conservation. And at African People and Wildlife, for us, everything is about win-win solutions, finding the balance for communities and nature. And we have a lot of tools and trainings that we're working on to help promote this rights-based approach in conservation in this part of the world. But I think we also have to recognize that there isn't always equity within communities themselves, right? And so one example of how we're using GIS to promote equity is with our Sustainable Rangelands initiative. Community members have common access, open access to pastures, but those people who have greater wealth or larger herds may have better information about the quality of the grasslands, or they may have better access to high quality grasslands based on their status in the community. By working with community members to better collect data on the quality of those grasslands through rangeland monitors, through GIS systems that collect this data and map it out for communities and then make it accessible to decision makers within the community. Having that information to science, Rae, whether it's science coming from academia or science coming from the community. It's access to information that helps drive powerful decision-making, and decision-making that can influence and positively impact a wider swath of the community than it would if that information was not available and decisions were simply being made by elite members of the community based on their personal interests. So I think equity goes from really the top of conservation down to the finest scale of where we're working. And yeah, by no means have we found the answer, but we have to keep pushing forward. We have to keep trying as much as possible to open up this process of inclusive conservation, and just do as much as we can to ensure that the voice is reaching everyone in the community, and then everyone throughout the conservation communities, whether it's local, indigenous, rural people, whether it's conservation NGOs and partners, whether it's district, regional, or national authorities. There has to be a conversation going on among all of them for us to be successful and to have that long-term sustainable trajectory.
What gives you hope for the future? And what's the importance of engaging youth in conservation to work towards a more sustainable future? Laly, would you like to continue on that?
Well, what gives me hope is what I've seen happen. I've seen community members rally around the issue of conflict, figure out how to combat it, figure out how to reduce conflict with their wildlife populations. And now we're seeing local wildlife populations recover, and recover in a world that is more tolerant of them in the future, because they're not having lions attack their livestock every day anymore. They're enjoying hearing the roar of the lion return to their landscapes, but are also feeling at peace that they're not going to be losing their prized cattle every night to these lions as well. So I see hope on the horizon. I see hope in young women like Rae, who are exploring her future and the way that she can make an impact. Youth absolutely is critical. And in Africa, 25% or more, 60% of the population of Tanzania are individuals under the age of 25. That's a huge force for conservation. If we give them the voice, if they seize that voice and are able to play a role in conservation, imagine what the future can be. So many ideas, so many potential solutions, so many creative ideas that can be opened up when we, again, embrace all aspects of society and conservation.
Rae, what gives you hope for the future?
Well, Laly actually took the words out of my mouth. She spoke on both, seeing with her own eyes and through her own work, the rebounding of wildlife populations, as well as seeing the potential in so many people from younger generations that are going to be able to be powerful leaders in this field. And that's exactly what I was going to say. I have the great fortune of working with large carnivores that are both endangered and that are formerly endangered and are now doing great. And so, especially when I'm working on, black bears and whatnot in the Western United States, I'm able to really work with a population of animals that was once on the brink of extinction in many places and is now healthy and thriving and doing well. That gives me a lot of hope, because they are doing well, not at the expense of anyone or anything. So as these bears have been increasing in population size and health and range, communities and economies have been thriving more than ever. And just entire landscapes have been revitalized alongside of this wildlife conservation. So it gives me tons of hope, and I'm able to really tap into that every day. And additionally, when I was in school and when I was early in my career, racial diversity was so low. And I know it wasn't an all-time low, but it was so low that the work was quite isolating, and it was hard for me to stay morally engaged. And really motivated to keep going, because there were so many barriers that were rooted in racism and discrimination. And that is still here with us. And yet there are so many people of color in the United States, I'm especially in touch with, who are, you know, rising through different types of systems, not just academic systems, and becoming leaders in all kinds of environmental protection. And that spells a beautiful, beautiful future. It also spells some discomfort, you know, in terms of traditions that conservation has rested on, but it is pointing towards a more just and equitable way that wildlife and landscape conservation is done. I'm super hopeful and really inspired and can't wait to be even a small part of those futures.
Alison, what gives you hope for the future?
Well, you have three true conservationists here who all started with species. And I think, you know, when you think about the global decline over the last half century, especially in species worldwide, the fact that we have success stories around species in each of our work is gives me a ton of hope. And so what I was going to share is that last week, one of the highlights of my week was being forwarded a link to the Facebook page for the Fort Belknap Indian community, where they had posted a den cam of a swift fox den with 4 new kits. And the reason this is significant is because those were the first kits born on tribal lands in more than a half a century. And this is just such a success as a species reintroduction effort, but also because of just the way that the Ani and Nakota community went about this. So this is a small carnivore about the size of a house cat, had been gone, as I said, for more than half a century. It was poisoned in the early 1900s inadvertently as a result of poison campaigns that were targeted at other species. And there are other swift fox populations in Montana. They are native to the short and mixed grass prairie, but there were some geographic barriers, physical barriers to getting this population back. And so the Ani and Nakota community led a reintroduction effort where a couple dozen swift fox were put back on tribal lands last September. And it's cool for a number of reasons. One, they brought a huge coalition of people together to do this. State and local government, tribal government, other NGOs. Our organization played a very small part, but Smithsonian, Defenders of Wildlife, World Wildlife Fund were all at the table. So it was like this true collaboration. A second really neat part to me was just the community engagement. From the beginning, all of their plans involved how do we engage the community and make them proud, or bring back this species, and how do we provide education opportunities? How do we encourage people to report sightings of these swift fox? And so the population, the swift foxes are all collared with GIS technologies. We're creating these incredible maps of where these foxes are going, and now we have these kits and these and talk about a way of engaging people at all generations. You know, Facebook is a very popular means of communication and social media tool in the community. And so just gave me great hope to think about all the eyeballs on that post and the celebration of that species. And I think in our area, the tribes have led bison restoration, black-footed ferret restoration, swift fox restoration, and they're just building on, of course, centuries and millennia of taking care of the land and their four-legged and winged relatives. And it's an inclusive community to be part of, to be able to be part of, and contribute in our way to these reintroduction efforts. So there's a lot of work to be done, of course, to protect species across the globe. But it's again really cool that we all can shine the light on some bright spots in our region.
On behalf of my colleagues and I, we are so deeply grateful for your support of this conversation today. It's been a great honor and education. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Very much.
Thank you.